Okay. Time to make a start. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to St. George's Talks. Schönen guten Abend, meine Damen und Herren, und herzlich willkommen in St. Georg's Gespräche. St. George's Talks comprise a monthly lecture series, which this month is online only. I'll begin by saying it is best if we all mute. The video is up to you. St. George's is a Grade 2 star listed building in Whitechapel in the East End of London. It was built in 1762 by German Lutherans who made a living in the East End sugar factories. That's the interior behind me now. It still has all its old box pews, its galleries, its wheezy organ, and its 10 commandment boards, which are in German, naturally. That is virtual reality behind me. That is not where I am. I'm presently at home, but that is the church as it exists. The themes of St. George's Talks reflect the history of St. George's. Our speaker this evening is a writer and a scholar, an authority on shipping and the Port of London, urban history and marine law in the last 200 years. She is Emeritus Professor of Maritime History at the University of Greenwich, Fellow of the Royal Historical Society and the Royal Society of Arts, and the former Head of History at Queen Mary College, University of London. And if that's not enough, for the Cambridge University Press, is currently just completing Maritime Metropolis, London and its Port from 1780 to the start of World War I, which was more or less when St. George's numbered pews were all at their fullest, and the trade of those within them depended on the goods arriving in the port. So, there is no one better to address the topic of our talk this month, the Sugarbakers and their history. So will you please welcome Professor Sarah Palmer.
Thank
Over
you,
to you, Sarah.
Right. I'm going to share screen in a minute, but I'm just going to say hello to everybody. Glad you're all here. I do apologize that we're perhaps online rather than me in person, but unfortunately I've got a wonky hip, so it was a bit difficult to travel. So I'm delighted to be here, but I'm particularly sad that I couldn't attend in person, as it were, because I'm one of those who has not actually been to St. George's as yet, but I certainly shall in the future. So friends, I'm going to be talking, as you can see in a minute, about Sugarbakers, an industry which is incredibly linked to those who are German migrants in the 19th century. Right, Rick, would you like me just to share screen now?
Yes, please. You go ahead, Sarah.
Right. There we go. That's what I want. Okay, in a minute. Slideshow from the beginning. Start. Okay, all right. Importing sugar was a major London trade in the 18th and 19th centuries. It was a trade established through the labor of enslaved people in the West Indies. It was the reason for the building of the West India docks and its warehouses at the start of the 19th century. The rum warehouses, which are the end ones shown here, are still available to be visited because they are now the site of the Museum of London, Docklands and Canary Wharf. The rest, I'm afraid, most of the rest have now gone. I want to start with a little bit of introduction about the sugar industry and sugar as a trade. As it still is today, sugar was an immensely popular product or ingredient, perhaps of its addictive properties. As tea and coffee drinking became more popular, so too did the use of sugar. Until the 1860s, most of the sugar arriving in London, and indeed other ports, came from Britain's colonies in the West Indies. Until mid-century, the 1850s, sugar imports were very heavily taxed by government, and sugar duties were a major source of government revenue. Duties on foreign-grown sugar were prohibitive, but there were also duties on sugar from the British colonies. That made sugar a very expensive product and largely unaffordable for poorer people. With the movement to free trade, beginning perhaps most notably with the abolition of the Corn Laws in 1846, came the opening up of many foreign trades, and sugar duties on foreign and colonial sugar imports fell. So sugar became cheaper, which also encouraged the development of mass-produced jam and biscuits. The country's population was growing too, but how much sugar everyone was consuming grew more. In the 1820s, on average, each person consumed 16 pounds of sugar every year. By the 1860s, that had become 34 pounds. By 1870, 47 pounds. By 1880, 64 pounds. And if you want some kind of comparison with today, in 2021, it was 66 pounds per head. So we've all loved sugar a lot. The sugar itself in the 19th and 18th and 19th centuries was predominantly cane sugar. Cane, of course, is a grass, but sugar made from beet coming in from Europe began to replace this in the 1870s. By 1900, about half the sugar consumed in the United Kingdom as a whole was beet sugar. The sugar that arrived in Britain and in London had already been processed to some extent. It wasn't ready to be sold. It needed to be refined. London was the country's main refining centre at the beginning of the 19th century, but that changed once other ports began to import sugar in greater and greater quantities. 100 years later, by 1900, Liverpool was the major refining centre. In second place was Greenwich in Scotland, and London had fallen to third place. Refined sugar, processed sugar, came in different forms, but there were two main types, hard sugar and soft sugar. Soft sugar is what we are familiar with today. Sugar lumps are probably the closest to traditional hard sugar that most of us consume. However, hard sugar was the most common type in the until the mid-19th century. But as the century drew to a close, soft sugar rapidly gained in popularity, with the result that by the 1880s, soft sugar, the sort we know today, had effectively replaced hard sugar, which unfortunately for London's sugar industry was its speciality. So this brings me to this evening's subject. The sugar that arrived in the Port of London came in large barrels called hogsheads. This is quite a fun picture showing, as you can see, a huge hogshead. They weren't all this huge, I think, but it's not quite clear what this hogshead is actually doing here outside what appears to be a grocer's. They're obviously playing about and so on, so it's a slightly mysterious image, and it's very doubtful, I think, that hogsheads like this stood outside most grocers. What would have been sold here in this grocer's, and indeed in other grocers, were conical, hard sugar loaves, advertised in the traditional sign, which you could see in this image. I can show again in this. This is what a sugar loaf looked like. It was a conical shape, quite large, actually. And in order to actually eat the sugar, you had to chip it off the sugar loaf, and then they'd put the sugar chips in a sugar bowl. Sometimes the grocer would provide the chips themselves, but sometimes people of wealth would actually buy a whole sugar loaf. The raw sugar, which, as I've said already, had also already been processed to a small extent before being shipped, had been processed in a sugar mill in the West Indies like this. What was produced in these sugar mills, and what we're seeing here is actually enslaved people, slaves, was a granular type of sugar, but it wasn't really suitable to be sold. So a complicated technological process had to take place once it arrived in port, a process known as sugar baking, never actually sugar refining. So what was this process about? I've got some nice pictures here. Incidentally, these images come from a very interesting book of the early 1850s called The Industries of London. And they give you a lot of images, in fact, of other industries as well. So what on earth is happening in this? We're going to move from left to right and then round to the bottom, and then I've got another one coming up. Right, here it is arriving in the sugar house, as they were called. And as you can see, it's sort of a kind of granular product, not very suitable to be eaten directly. What happened next, and that's the middle image at the top, was that it was melted and then clarified, refined to a degree by adding, wait for it, blood, lime water, and charcoal made from animal bones. It was then boiled again, and scum, which appeared on the top, was removed. It was now a dark reddish color due to the addition of the blood. It was then filtered, and we are looking to the third one along now. It was filtered through large cloth filters into a kind of tank below. These are huge, aren't they? After it had gone through the cloth filters, what came out was then went into, it was filtered then into through large charcoal filters, which is what's shown on the bottom right. The next thing that happened was that it was boiled in a vacuum pan. You can see this huge piece of equipment in the image right at the bottom on the left. So once it had been boiled in the vacuum can, it then was emptied out and poured into these kind of molds, which, as you can see, are the shape of the cones I showed you earlier. When it was set, it was then trimmed and baked in an oven. In fact, an oven room, the whole of the top floor in most sugar houses was actually devoted to this oven in order to make everything bake and firm. When you got to the next stage, it was then turned out. It had been trimmed, as you can see there on the bottom right, and turned out and then wrapped in traditional, what we know, some of us will remember, the traditional sugar paper, which is blue sugar paper, ready to go off to be sold. So you can see the kind of process it is. And it's also, you can also see how complex it is. Also, how very large scale. So this is not a straightforward processing. It's a real industrial process. The sugar houses themselves were large, very imposing industrial buildings. They had to be. What I've shown here is the sugar refinery, which was in Leman Street. There are actually other refineries along the road as well, the street as well, if you can see them. I've got here a description from George Dodd's Days at the Factories, which tells you a little bit about it. Among the largest buildings in the eastern half of the metropolis, and their numerous floors, their ranges of innumerable windows, and the nature of the processes conducted, they are in every way remarkable establishments. And sadly, I may say, not one of these immense industrial buildings remains in London. Though in some other parts of the country, there are some that have survived in various forms. As one might expect, this sugar baking business was highly capital intensive. It had very high current costs. They used a lot of fuel as well as water. So to be involved as an entrepreneur in this or in a company or a firm was not at all for the faint-hearted. The historian who specializes in insurance records for London found that in the 1820s, 2/3 of refiners insured their premises for £3,000 a year or more. That would be about £363,000 today. So the insurance had to be high because what was in these buildings and the buildings themselves were very valuable and costly. The fire risk was also considerable, as newspaper reports like this show. I will read it out, but I have to say one of the advantages of doing things online like this is actually easier sometimes for someone to read it, but I will go through it quickly. The well-known sugar house and refinery Messrs. Goodhart, situated in Horseferry Road, Limehouse, was last evening entirely destroyed by fire, involving a very heavy loss. The factory was one of the largest of the kind in the metropolis. It was 9 stories in height, 200 feet in length, and 80 foot in depth. And it flanked the river entrance of the Regent's Canal dock. So actually we can work out exactly where that was. The property was of lofty proportions, and to travellers on the river and Blackwall Railway formed a very prominent block of buildings. And then they go on to explain, the fire itself, the discovery, and so on, and the where it started, and how people nearly perished, and one of them was seriously burnt. So this is major, but note it comes from the Times because the sugar industry was a major industry and it merited a report in the Times. We don't know exactly when sugar houses began operating in London, but there were certainly some here in the 16th century. In the late 18th century, the main cluster was in the City of London along Lower Thames Street. Here they were close to the foreign trade quays which handled sugar. After the West India docks opened, however, on the Isle of Dogs in the early 1800s, sugar houses spread east into Wapping, Whitechapel, and Limehouse. It became a very dominant East End industry, but I have to say there were sugar houses on the South Bank as well and elsewhere, and there were some also near Lower Thames Street right to the end of the century. So it wouldn't be fair to say it was entirely an East End industry. Commercially, sugar baking was highly competitive. There were lots of firms. The amount of business depended on the tonnage of sugar arriving in London, which in turn depended on the state of the market. Was there the demand for the sugar? Until the move to free trade in the 1840s, foreign sugar was effectively excluded by extremely high customs duties. So they were reliant entirely, until the mid-century, on imports from the colonies. And these actually fell in the 1820s and 30s, which was a period of a fell downturn in trade. So you can see this is the kind of explanation for these figures. The figures are rather, this strangely dotted about, I have to say, because it is actually very difficult to find sources which give you this kind of information. And reliance on directories, of course, has, of course, the weakness that there might be others that don't appear in the directories. But owners of sugar baking houses, sugar bakers, would have been keen to advertise their wares. So I think you can think it's a reasonable kind of estimate. So in 1823, you've got 81 different firms, some of which were very small, I'm sure. And then by 1840s, this had halved. And as we'll see in a minute, a bit later on, although there are fewer firms in the 1860s and very few in the 1880s, certainly in the 1860s, the few surviving firms were much bigger enterprises than the earlier ones. Free trade also brought in more imported sugar, imported from all over the world, not just the British colonies. But it also meant that there were imports, particularly from Europe, from already refined sugar, which was to be a problem later in the century. After the 1860s, things, as we'll see, got more difficult for London sugar baking firms.
We're not
Soft
seeing any movement in the slides at the moment.
There's not any movement.
No,
You
we
can't
can't see the number of sugar baking firms in London at the moment.
You've got, yes, there shouldn't be any, you're stuck with it for a minute. Okay. Okay, I'll move on to another in a minute. I want you to keep looking at this for a minute, okay? After this, after the 1860s, things got more difficult for London sugar baking firms. Soft sugar gained public and retail popularity, and refining firms in London and Greenwich, in Liverpool and Greenwich, responded to this with investment in large factories suited to producing sugar from beet. So you've got soft sugar coming from cane sugar, but more and more sugar coming and being this with the source, the sugar beet system. The market for a few London sugar baking firms switched to beet and soft sugar, but very few. But the market for hard sugar loaves collapsed, along with London's sugar baking industry. By the 1890s, only one of the old firms, actually one that exceptionally was not a German firm, Martineau's, which was a Huguenot family, survived. Newcomers to London, the soft sugar refiners Tate and Lyle's, two different firms at one point, at this point, set up downriver in Silvertown, Essex, in what for London was effectively a new industry. But we'll get back to that. Now, let's get away from the numbers. I will get back to the numbers a bit and get on to what I think is much more interesting, and that is the people who were involved in this particular industry. This is where I have to record, gratefully, my debt to the work of Brian Moore, which is the cover of their book, his book, but there's a lot more than this, which I've shown you here. The slide shows on the right the actual cover of the book, which summarizes much of his work, but probably much more of greater value more generally is the incredible sugar baking and refining database, which he has produced. And I've given you the link there if one wants to look. Basically, if you want to find a sugar baker anywhere in the country, you can look at this and you can find out about them as much as is possibly known about them. And as a source, it's continually being refined. So it's a very, very useful source. You'll see, and I'm sure many of you know this already and you know this work, you'll see that this is a publication of the Anglo-German History Society. And the reason is for this is what, again, you certainly will know, is that most of the men in the London sugar baking industry had emigrated, had migrated from Germany. Most of the sugar baking firms in the 1860s were owned by Germans, and at least one German employer became a very wealthy man and also a generous one. When he died in 1829, he left generous legacies to his laborers. But the workers in most firms were overwhelmingly of German origin. So that's the kind of context for which I'm going to go on a bit more. Right, I delved a little bit into the 1851 census enumerators reports for East End parishes. As now, every 10 years, there was a national census, and just as now, the census was based on individuals going around, the census enumerators, who went to every house, every property, and tried to discover who was living in the property, their background, their origin, their age, and their marital status, and sometimes a bit more. And they drew that this was the basis of the census. So it's a very, very valuable source, but it's really quite difficult to penetrate, although you can penetrate it, and it is in fact online. So if one wants, you can delve into this, but it's not particularly easy. what I'm going to show now, and I don't expect you to be able to read this, don't worry, is Ancestry, incidentally, which has these census enumerators books, has reproduced them. What I'm showing you here is from the census of 1851, the census enumerators books. And it's the enumerator who called, in this case, number 68 Ratcliffe Highway in April 1851. Census is always in April. And it's noted that this property was the property of the Messrs. Goodharts, who were a German firm, owned by a German. And living here, the census actually says, was John Cars, who was 64 years old, born in Germany. Anne Cars, who was 57 years old, born in Worcestershire, so not of German origin, and their daughter, presumably Mary Cars, who was born in Whitechapel. Presumably, these are the foreman, manager, his wife, and the daughter. Also living here, however, were 30 young men, most in their 20s, a few in their teens, with their occupation listed as sugar refiner. And I think you can probably see this. Sugar refiner, workman. All of these, virtually all of these in this particular firm, were born in Hanover, Germany. And most of them also, we can perhaps assume, were temporary migrants, not permanent residents. They came over to London for perhaps a couple of years, maybe a bit longer, saved their wages, and then returned home to Germany. When in London, they usually stayed in lodgings provided by their employers. So this is, they're not the men working there, the people who are living here listed there. When they were there, they were encouraged to attend one of the German churches, St. George's as well, particularly, and they married and baptized their children in these churches. They altogether joined into a larger community of Germans in Stepney. In fact, the whole area was known as Little Germany. However, perhaps early in the century, it was mostly young men coming over in this way and then returning to Germany. But a German historian, Horst Rossler, who's investigated them, as it were, from the German end, has also discovered that certainly from mid-century, second half of the century, many of these became, family men and settled, marrying mainly Germans, young women coming in from Hanover, working perhaps as maids or servants in some capacity, and then they joined, they married and they settled. So it's would be quite not correct to say they're all migrants, temporary migrants. Some undoubtedly settled, as we'll show a little bit later. So they became part of a wider community of Germans, but certainly they were the predominant occupation, these German migrants. Their reputation was one of sober, very respectable workers who attended their church and so on. But it's worth noting that they could actually be quite fierce. And there's quite a lot of evidence and evidence of, some kind of incidents which showed, if you like, the other side of being a German sugar baker. In 1825, for example, the press recorded that there was a fight between Hanoverian sugar bakers and Germans with other occupations from the Black Forest. And somebody who I gave this paper to in the past suggested perhaps there might have been a religious basis for this, in part at least, because the Hanoverians were Protestant and the Germans from the Black Forest tended to be Catholic. So there was a furious street fight. There's also another report, perhaps a more sort of interesting one in some ways. In 1834, the workers at Goodhart, so perhaps some of these workers, perhaps, if they'd stayed on, in 1834, Goodhart workers violently attacked officials who called to actually check on the scales where you measured the sugar. And when they appeared to cast some doubt on whether the scales were fair, were called out, and it would appear by Goodhart himself, and in fact attacked this jury, as it was called, and hurt some of them quite considerably. And some of these men were in fact fined, and the employer may have been fined too, but we don't really quite know because it didn't go to the Old Bailey for a trial or anything. So, you know, these were not actually, these may have been, you know, very, very sober on a very good day, but they were certainly prepared to defend their employer when they felt they needed to. And then finally, a later example, in 1864, there was a trial and in the conviction of, in fact, a German tailor who was sadly for this man hanged. And there was quite a lot of concern in advance of this hanging of this German, because it was feared that the Sugarbakers might riot in the street. They didn't actually do so, but it just shows that's a different side to the reputation of the German Sugarbakers than some of us have always assumed. At least I certainly had before.
Can I just ask?
Yes.
When you first introduced this slide, you referred to cars as the head of the firm, the Goodhart.
Yes.
Was that the name Cars?
No, I don't. I don't know what his is. I'm not sure. I can check actually in this magnificent database. I'm not absolutely sure. I think it's a different name actually. I think he's perhaps one of the younger ones.
I can see the name. I can see the name Claus or Klaus.
Yes, but he doesn't appear himself.
He's not there.
He's not there. He's not living there.
Yeah.
There is some evidence that some of them, they were managers and they were owners and moved away. But at the same time, there are cases, undoubtedly, it's referred to in the Moore database, where they actually did still live on the premises. But as one can see from the images earlier of the processes, it wasn't entirely a pleasant place to live, and sugar baking was actually a very smelly process. So you wouldn't perhaps desire absolutely to be there.
No.
But this is actually, I think I really do like this. Yes, there's some cars there. You're quite right. These are the two cars.
I can't see the car's name.
Yes, I can't. It's an initial. It's an initial.
Oh, I see. Well, there is the Klaus there, and the church has a benefactors board with the name Klaus on it. It's quite a common name, I suppose, but it's possible that they may be linked.
They may be linked. Yes, it may not be that common. Yes, most of them are the initials. One can imagine the enumerator perhaps struggling a bit with the names, and therefore, going straightforwardly. It's also possible, of course, that they didn't actually see these particular men, but the main the foreman would have perhaps just gone through the list and told them who was actually living there. So you can't really be quite sure. But it's quite, it's. I mean, for me, and there are obviously other examples if you go through the Illuminators books. For me, it gives you a sort of feel for the large numbers of men that are here, and the kind of situation. And also, of course, it gives you more than a feel. It actually gives you their name, their ages, and clearly they came from Hanover. Now, why did they come from Hanover? Reasonable question. Let's start with why did they come from Germany in the first place? Firstly, I mean, Britain in the 19th century was obviously an industrializing country, highly industrialized into international terms, and the center of many industrial opportunities, working opportunities. On the other hand, Germany, including Hanover, clearly there's an area around Hamburg where this wouldn't necessarily apply. Germany was still basically an agricultural or fishing community, whether you're on the coast, agricultural, pretty underdeveloped. It still had its major industrial revolution to come. So London offered opportunities for those young men to make some money and bring some money back, which perhaps others didn't. Migration to the United States was really not really quite got going, but once it really got going from the 1850s, it's quite clear that some German migrants might have used it as a kind of stepping off point to actually travel to the United States. So the pattern did change a bit. It's also been suggested, and this doesn't seem to me be impossible, that one of the reasons that Hanover seems to have been a particular supplier of these workmen was that because the the Georges, the monarchs, were Hanoverians, of course. So there was some suggestion that they regarded themselves in some sense as British citizens. You didn't have to prove citizenship or anything to work, by the way. You just came. So that might have been another sort of connection that people made in their minds, that they were going to a country which in a sense they were also part. So I think it is very interesting. Okay, as we've seen, sugar baking was very tough work. It certainly wasn't as cozy as is suggested by my next slide. Okay. This comes from a children's book, The History of a Pound of Sugar, Rhymes and Pictures, 1862. And I shall read out this because they're all slaving away, working along with their moulds, etc. How sugar, when refined, is cooled in moulds of the familiar shape is known to most. So having passed through many a peril, pinch and scrape, we find it now exposed for sale by grocers, wholesale and retail. So clearly not, I may say, a great poet by any standard. And of course, this is a pretty cozy picture of what sugar baking involved. And we actually have a number of more accurate reports, which will take me to my next one. This is showing up terribly well. I don't quite know. Okay. This is a extract from a sugar refinery, which was in Martineau's, which is one of the few survivors of the nearly 1880 here. And tours of sugar houses were sort of popular, but it wasn't a particularly pleasant tour, you might say. Anyway, I will read it to you, though, as I say, it's perhaps not very clear. The images may get in the way, I don't know. The factory whose operations we have attempted to describe is, we believe, one of the largest and one of the most ably managed and in the process of refinery, as far as the general features we are concerned. It will be seen the process is not particularly complicated. I would slightly disagree, but anyway. But the almost intolerable heat in some parts, the intricacy of the buildings, the unavoidably grimy and dirty nature of much of the work, the vast complication of machinery, the steam and noise, the weird pictures of operatives naked to the waist and working sometimes in semi-darkness, all combine to render a study of sugar refinery one of the most curious and at the same time one of the most trying ordeals that an ordinary investigator can very well undergo. He's almost sorry for himself, it seems, and for the workers. It is, however, well worth seeing, and as such establishments are usually somewhat exclusive, we have to acknowledge a special courtesy on the part of the proprietors in permitting a visit, which at a time when so much is heard of these establishments cannot fail to have more than usual interest. So this is the conditions these men worked in. It was undoubtedly a very tough job, and I think one might say a young man's job, and which perhaps in part explains the youth, at least, of the actual workmen, as opposed to the foreman or manager. Okay, I want to return again to the table I showed you earlier. Okay. As we saw, by 1880, if we look at the actual workforce, as opposed to the number of firms and the output, the number of sugar bakers, men undertaking this, was very much reduced. The government report where I found these numbers was pretty relaxed about this, since no English workers were affected. Note here, and the report, in fact, comes from 1881, but they're quoting for an earlier one. Note here, by the way, only that 1864, all the workmen in loaf houses were German. German was the current language in most of the sugar houses, so the English workmen had not been displaced to any extent worth mentioning. Obviously, weren't very concerned about the German workers, it was just that English workers were not displaced. Because those statistics which I've shown you before clearly show the numbers of workers in much reduced, and we need to explain how this happened. The reason for review again, the reason for the decline in the sugar baking industry in London was, as I've described, the changing conditions in the industry, the growth of soft sugar refining, the development of sugar beet refining, and the business of sugar making, increasingly refining, moved away from London, where the specialization had been very much the hard sugar side of the business. So the industry itself, one might say, actually collapsed in a remarkably short period of time. Maybe the assumption of this report, Farah, it was a pretty tough board of trade official I've encountered in other contexts, but maybe the assumption was that many of these workers had actually returned to Germany. It's possible that some did return home and found work in the German baking industry back home, or they could have stayed sugar baking industry, or perhaps they could have transferred to some of the other German industries in London, which included bakers of bread type, bakers and cakes and so on, and also casual labour work in the docks and on the wharves. But we do know that those who had devoted their whole working lives to London's sugar baking industry didn't do so well. This is an extract from a report which happens to have survived of a charity known as Friends of Foreigners in Distress, which had been established in 1806. And this is a report in 1883, the lovely, the stranger at the bottom, that has actually survived. A lot of these, there must have been annual reports, I think, every year, but this one has survived, and it gives you, I think, a sense of the people who are involved in the industry in the way that the figures and the summaries can never do. So this was a charity which basically they collected subscriptions from people who were concerned about foreigners in difficulty in London, and they subscribed, but then they voted, these Friends of Foreigners, on who should be assisted and who should not. So, the fact you're listed here by no means meant that you were going to be given any help. So we start off with Joanna Breyer. She's 67 years. She's a native of Hanover, and she's 34 years in this country. It's perhaps somebody who came out as a housemaid, servant, and then married her husband. Her husband was a sugar baker who died in 1881. Poor Joanna. She has earned a meagre living by sewing sacks for sugar houses. She has an only son, a dock labourer, who has a family of 4 to support. And although he is very kind to his aged mother, he can do nothing more for her than give her a dinner at his table on Sundays. I mean, that's just, does evoke real people, doesn't it? Then you've got number 12 amongst those who are in this contest. I cannot pronounce the name, I'm afraid, so it might help me here. Somebody. Anyway, Tija, I don't know, I can't pronounce it. He's aged 72. He's a native of Hanover, and he was 51 years in this country, so he'd come early. He was here when he was young. He has worked the greater part of his life as a sugar baker, and afterwards of a dock labourer. That's the language. He is now almost past work of any kind, wretchedly poor. And then we come to Marty Schrieffer, age 72 again, native of Hanover again, 48 years in this country. He's one of the old class of sugar bakers and was kept on by Messrs. Martineau until their premises were burnt 4 years ago. And since then has been unable to find employment and is in fact past work, wife an Englishwoman, an aged and respectable man. The point here is, of course, they were foreigners, so they didn't qualify for the poor law, relief through the poor law, punitive though that could often be, because you had to be born and settled in the country. So these really, when they couldn't get work, and as old people, old men, old women as well, there probably weren't all that many opportunities for them. They really were in a desperate state. So you get in a way here, I think, into the insight of the collapse of the industry, the personal insight into the collapse of the industry, which I think, is quite striking. London's sugar baking, the baking industry, had come to an end, but this wasn't by any means the end of sugar refining in London. From the 1880s, virtually all sugar refining in the metropolis was in hands of two new competing firms, all very familiar to us by name, Henry Tate and Sons, a Liverpool family, who opened a factory in 1878, and another refining firm, this time Lyle's from Greenwich, from Scotland, which opened in 1883. Both had their premises, their factories, they did describe them as factories, downriver in Silvertown, close to the Victoria Docks, as I've said. It's interesting, these are outsiders. They've come to London with a background in sugar refining elsewhere. So they're not part of the old group of sugar refiners or firms. Martineau's was the survivor, and did survive, but he's there. This is the only one. So this is, in a sense, as I've said earlier, a new industry. Got some images. This is Lyle's new refinery at Plaistow, West Ham, in 1892. An interesting photograph, as you can see. You've got the barrels and you've got a tall building, but this is a refinery of the new sort, producing soft sugar. Okay. Both the firms, Tate and Lyle's, struggled a bit in the early years, but each prospered by finding a niche in the market. For the Tate family, it was exploiting a patent for a new type of hard sugar, the sugar lump. For Lyle's, it was golden syrup. And by 1921, the rival firms had amalgamated, becoming Tate and Lyle, familiar names. And this is a really rather nice photograph of the Tate and Lyle Thames Sugar Refinery in 1921. This is a very different industry from the old industry. Outsiders, not actually great employers of labor, because it was basically machines and you didn't need all the kind of skills, though you did need a certain amount of skill. And in fact, the highly skilled workers were paid quite well. But it's a different sort of industry. It's a mass production industry. I mean, it notes the barges and so on, very important into London terms. It's on the river so that they could bring in their supplies of sugar, raw sugar, by the river and take them away by the river. So this is a London industry in a way perhaps that only indirectly the older industry was. How are we doing? By 1900, London sugar refining was barely recognizable, as I'm saying. It was also from diffused ownership. It had become very, very concentrated, in fact, in terms of really effectively owned two companies, located far away from its traditional centre. And actually, in terms of output, I think this is quite interesting, it was a smaller industry. It wasn't producing as much sugar as it had earlier in its history. I think it's perhaps hard, I do think it's hard to regret the passing of an industry which involved so much physical hardship and in the end for some people such devastation in to their working lives. But I think it is sad that it's largely forgotten, except of course amongst the sugar baking descendants fraternity. Thank goodness for that. I don't want to end on a sad note, so here is a stunning photograph of London's refining industry today. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you very much, Professor Sarah. That was a most interesting and engaging talk, and full of lots of information. I wonder if people have questions. I was noting down a few things on the way.
Yes,
I was in whose blood I've written down here. When you said that the sugar, raw sugar, was mixed with blood of an animal, presumably. Of
an animal. London, of course, did have very large imports of cattle.
Yes.
So, and which was slaughtered, and they were slaughtered. I mean, later on in the century, you get refrigeration, you get frozen or semi-frozen meat, preserved meat of various sorts coming in. But and really until late in the 19th century, you had a very vibrant, raw cattle trade. Some actually coming from the United States who were actually slaughtered in London.
Yes.
So on. So it must have been a fairly ready supply of blood for the
Yes. So using bits of the cow that weren't otherwise
yes,
being
exactly,
used.
exactly.
But why what was that ingredient doing? Why?
Well, unfortunately, I'm not a chemist.
Yes.
But it had the effect, presumably it's protein, if somebody's protein, isn't it? It had the effect of clarifying and producing the scum on the top. I mean, pretty revolting, isn't it? Scum on the top. And then they added everything else to, but I mean, basically, as I understand it from reading, the contemporary accounts of the process, the redness which had to be got rid of was because of the blood that was used.
Yeah. But is blood still an ingredient of
No, I
sugar?
believe not. No, no. Sugar beet, of course, is different. You see, it's in a way.
Yeah.
It's the beet. Well, you can see, you can understand that from all this sort of that it's in a very different kind of state. It's a different kind of process. You don't need to do all this boiling down in this way.
I see. So blood was only an ingredient of sugar cane production.
Yes, absolutely.
I see. Now, if anyone would like to ask a question, please go ahead, raise your hand, or I suppose call out. Also, I was interested in why that conical shape for the sugar loaf? Was that for stacking purposes or a funnel?
Yes. Well, it's interesting. Somebody, Rick will know this because he's heard me do this before.
Yes.
Somebody who in fact is an architect and a scientific engineering person, who was at the previous talk, I was asked this question and said, well, I've fumbled a bit. And he said, no, it's because a cone, transportation was essential to this. They were going to be transported. A cone in physical terms is a perfect shape, the conical shape, that it keeps its shape for reasons of scientific reasons. Therefore, and it worked. The other reason is that these molds that they were put into had a little hole at the bottom.
Yes.
So that they could drain the extraneous liquid. And again, that's the shape, it's sort of triangle, isn't it? Which would do this. So that's the shape. But I agree, it's a sort of puzzling shape. But I saw as he explained this that a square is not a cube is not a good shape.
No.
To be
the picture you showed was of them upturned and into a bottle, as you were saying just then.
That's right.
There was a draining process.
And what doesn't show up very well in the image is that those who are filling them had a sort of kind of a container they were holding, which had a funnel so they could actually fill them and not waste too much, because you didn't want to waste too much. So it's an interesting, and I don't totally disagree with the intrepid reporter who went round because it is quite a process. This is not straightforward. It's got lots of stages.
Yes.
Could I just suggest that you stop showing the slides so we can see who's speaking?
That's good point, Imo. Thank you.
Hang on, let's see what we can do.
There's an observation from someone named Jerry in the chat that Teacher Hilkins, who was one of the people mentioned in your census return, his death was recorded in the December quarterly of St. George's in the East End in 1884.
Oh.
Yeah.
Well. That's good. Connections made.
Yes.
A couple of things. As you said, the cone shape was so that it can drain. You had to use centrifugal forces once they invented, which actually was invented in Czechoslovakia, the process to make sugar cubes, thing that White Tate could survive. So you needed another force to do basically the same thing.
That's right.
Also, you showed the process in the 1850s, and you showed the vacuum vat at the very end where they boiled the sugar. That was a very good invention for the workers, because in the time when St. George's was founded and when they were doing the sugar around St. George's, it was open vats. So you were boiling sugar in the same size of vats that you showed in the pictures. You had people standing next to it, so you could show. But and then anybody who has ever boiled sugar knows that even the little pot on our stove is dangerous. So that was another thing, which also is why there is a quote that the Germans did it because not even the Irish were prepared to work in sugar sugar fineries. No, and I have the quote, it's in a publication. So, you know, even so you had to have the foreigners who, you know, couldn't be employed in other industries, probably because language.
That's rather tongue-in-cheek, I presume. But
well, I don't know how tongue-in-cheek, apparently. I mean, it must have been a factual thing.
Yeah.
Because of course, you know, if you wanted foreign workers in London, usually the Irish were easily available most of the time.
Yeah.
Anyway, I found the quote. When I found the quote, I found it quite interesting.
Very.
I
see Mr. Jones has a point to raise.
Yeah, hi.
Hi.
From my own readings and research, I discovered that there were quite a few sugar refineries, small ones in Whitechapel and Shadwell. And these could be very dangerous places, kind of unregulated. There's and as you alluded to earlier, the temperatures they had to work under was severe, anything up to 140 degrees at times, and also the boilers could explode and people would die. But from things that I have read was that in some of these refineries, workers were offered up to 8 pints of beer a day to hydrate themselves, which after finishing work would have they would have been in a completely different state. One of the things I wanted to just very quickly was Henry Tate. He bought from other research I've done, he bought a patent for the sugar cube from an engineer called Eugene Langer, who then went on to build the Wuppertal monorail in Germany. So there's a connection there between Tate and Germany.
I lived in Wuppertal. I've never heard that. I will be interesting to find. I will research that.
You do. I think you'll find I am
Another
right.
German connection.
I will definitely research that.
Yes.
Yes, it's interesting just to sort of add into that. Obviously, there were sugar refineries, bakers elsewhere in the country, and important. But then none of them employed German workers in the same way as London. It was very much a
Liverpool did. Sorry, Liverpool did.
Yes, but not on the same scale, at least not according to Brian Moore's book.
Okay, fair enough. He's the expert. That's true.
But was it a skill that they had already developed in Germany and brought here, or did they simply come to do what the Irish wouldn't do, as you suggested?
Well, my understanding is that there was sugar baking, already on the continent in Germany. So the skill, was there. I mean, I have to say on the Irish quip, one has to say there was there's a huge prejudice against Irish in London. Huge, and Germans, though, as we know, there's an unhappy history in the First World War. Were regarded very favourably, as I would best gather from general commentators.
Yeah. So, was there a sense? Was there a sense that Henry Tate, English firms were taking over what had previously been German then?
I don't think so. I don't think that signified then, because this is before the anti-German feeling around the First World War. So I think it's just that they were very enterprising families, and of course Tate was not only enterprising. He was also an incredible philanthropist. Who's, you know, he's the Tate Gallery.
Yes.
That's the Tate. So
Yeah.
But I think, you know, they just could see an opportunity in London.
Well, was he employing a German workforce? Do you know?
No, he doesn't. I mean, that's pretty certain. They brought their workers with them, actually.
Yeah.
As far as one can tell, you know, any workers they used, they brought with them from.
Who's they? Do you mean Tate or
Tate and Lyle, you know, respectively, when they moved
brought
out,
them from?
they from you know, Liverpool or
I
Greenwich.
see.
You know,
I see.
so it wasn't you know, it wasn't a massive employer of people, because the process was different. I mean, it's a very manual process, isn't it? I mean, obviously there's technology as well, but we know you see it's interesting.
Yes. Given that there was such a large German workforce, it's surprising that, or maybe there is, but German vocabulary in the industry that might have come into English. But is there? Do you
Not
know?
as far as I know, but it may be, because if it's a German workforce, German speaking, and people speak German
Yes.
to each other, it doesn't, you know, go out into the wider world.
Yeah. Yeah. Good. Well, does anyone have anything else to ask, observe?
Yes, I have an observation for Mr. Jones and the lots of beer. It was small beer, so they said about 1 to 2% alcohol. Basically, it was, especially in the 1700s, safer than water. So,
Okay.
but because you're right, I think probably because of the beer, but also because they worked with naked they didn't have any shirts on. There was a time when the moral people around them didn't think they were very moral people because of both of those things. So there are remarks of that one in the 1700s. Because Sarah, you said about, you know, the reputation. There is discussion about that as well. On those levels.
Yeah, no. Well, of course, I mean, just to say, other heavy industries, steel making and so on, always had an allowance of beer, because you just lose so much, you know, through sweat, and you know, you get very dehydrated.
Yeah.
You had to.
Good. Well, I think that concludes things this evening. Thank you very much again, Sarah, for a most engaging and enlightening talk.
Thank
you. And thank you everybody for coming this evening. In a month's time, 3rd Tuesday of July, we have a talk on Albrecht Dürer, the German artist, given by David Van Edwards, who is an art historian, lecturer, and happens to be president of the Lute Society, which is not exactly related to art history, but lute making is certainly an artistic pursuit in many ways. So that's to look forward to. And then we take a break in August until the autumn. September, we resume the St. George's talks with an evening of Lutheran hymn singing. The conductor of the Christmas choir, who is a researcher and musicologist, will give a talk about Lutherans, but it will be an audience participation evening at the same time. So that, again, is to look forward to. But that's all for now. Once again, Professor Sarah, thank you so much for talking to us this evening and filling us in a little bit more on the community that once occupied the stalls of St. George's Church. Thank you all very much.
I would like to mention also that at the beginning of September, the Organ Vespers resume at 6 p.m. on the first Saturday of each month.
Thank you very much for that, Imo. Yes, of course. So there are 2 monthly activities that use the church. on its behalf.